Okay, thank you so much for your coming. So let's just first use these slides, quickly summarize what we have learned last class. So we are in a chapter to understand economic growth. So this is a globe map, but we use different color to highlight the level of income. But then, so this level of income just give us the idea of standard of living, right? So we can see here, so we live in North America, right? So this basically is a wealthiest part of the world. But if we look at in the middle of the map, you can see Africa. So there are a lot of population live in Africa. They live under absolute poverty in the sense, so they live less than $3 per day. Okay, so you can see, so economic growth, there's a quite divergence in terms of economic growth, and that just turns into different standard of living. But now in this chapter, so we are going to understand, we are going to see the facts, and then so we are going to understand what determines the difference in economic growth. Yeah. And in last class, we also explained the rule of 70. Essentially, if a country grows by X% per year, it's going to take 70 divided by X years to double its income. Okay? So this rule of 70 just gives us the power of compounding. A small number is going to translate into a large number over time, right? So actually, we can see from these two practice questions we have studied last class, right? Okay, and here, so I'll just show you the recent growth experience across countries. So you can see there are some countries grow extremely fast, but there are some other but there are other countries instead of grow, their economy stagnant, right? And then so you can apply the rule of 70 to understand what would happen over the long term. Okay. Now, in the last part of last class, we try to understand the source of long-run growth. Well, in terms of long-run growth, so we use labor productivity to approximate the progress we made in long-run growth. So labor productivity essentially is output per worker. So that's going to determined by the following factors: physical capital. So that includes buildings, machines, or equipments, and human capital. So that's essentially the knowledge, skills. So we have workers, and then technological progress, right? So that's essentially technological know-how, right? So we have better way to produce goods and service, and then we have more efficient way to organize our workplace. Okay. And then, so we are going to put everything together to understand what determines the labor productivity. And here, so we are going to have a aggregate production function, which is a hypothetical function that shows how productivity measured by real GDP per worker, that is going to depend on quantity of physical capital, human capital, and the state of technology. Okay, and usually we are going to have a function form like this equation. On the left-hand side, you have GDP per worker. So that's labor productivity. On the right-hand side, so the GDP per worker is going to be determined by physical capital per worker, human capital per worker, and then lastly, technology. Okay. And here, so we have a power term here. In a more advanced class, you will learn, so these numbers is going to reflect the contribution of each factor on GDP per worker or on labor productivity. Or in other words, this 0.4 just tells us, so 40% of growth will be will coming from physical capital, right? Now, regarding to this aggregate production function, so there are some well-known patterns. So those patterns are summarized by observing our data. So this pattern includes diminishing return to physical capital. This says if we hold the amount of physical capital per worker and instead of technology fixed, and then so if we increase the amount of physical capital by a marginal amount, and then you're going to see a smaller and smaller increase in labor productivity. Like here, there's an example. So if you have one computer, and then so this computer will brings you a significant improvement in your productivity. Now, if you get second computer, and then this second computer probably won't bring you too much additional productivity. And this is called diminishing return to physical capital. Okay. And on the graph, we can see this diminishing return by looking at this production function. So here, so this production function is a projection, because remember, the labor productivity is going to depend on three things: T, physical capital, and human capital. Now, in order to virtualize this diminishing return to physical capital, okay, and then so we are going to fix T, fix H. Now we only show the relationship in labor productivity versus physical capital. Now you can see, so this is an increasing curve, meaning the more physical capital you have, and then the higher labor productivity we are going to obtain. But this curve is flattening out, right? Or in other words, so if we find a slope of this curve, and you can see as long as we move toward right-hand side of the horizontal line, or as we increase the physical capital, the curve becomes flatter and flatter. The slope of this curve actually just gives us the marginal benefit of additional physical capital on real GDP per worker. Okay, so this flattening out of this curve reflects the decrease in marginal return to physical capital, as we observed in previous slides. Okay. All right. The diminishing return to physical capital is based on the assumption all other things equal, meaning so T is same, human capital is fixed. So in the sense, this diminishing return may disappear if we can keep increasing, we can keep increase or keep improve the amount of human capital or technology or both. Okay. So this is represented by the diagram here. So if we fix T and H, T stands for technology, H stands for human capital. If we fix those two things, and then certainly there's a diminishing return to physical capital. Now, if in the meantime, we manage to improve technology, we somehow acquire more human capital by training our workers, by getting better education. And then what I'm going to see is, so this curve is going to shift outward, right? And then if we increase capital from 0 to 20,000, you have a gain of 30,000 in labor productivity. Now, if we increase from 20,000 to 50,000, this is a 30,000 increase. Now you can see the increase in output is significant, and certainly this is larger than 3,000. So that reflects the breakdown of diminishing marginal return to physical capital. But this breaks down comes from the fact that technology and human capital, they also get improved when you increase physical capital. Okay. Now, given this aggregate production function, we can do a very interesting, at the same time, a very important exercise. So this exercise is called growth accounting. And this growth accounting is used to answer the following questions. If we observe a country grow by 2%, say for example, that's for the US during the past century. Now we are trying to decompose the source of this growth, right? So 2%, where does this 2% coming from? Okay. And certainly it can come from change in physical capital, or it can come from change in human capital, right? Just remind yourself how we write down the production function. Okay, and then this growth accounting essentially is used to estimate the contribution of each major factor in the aggregate production function to the observed economic growth. Right? So we observe 2% or 8%, or in some African countries, negative 2%. Now we are trying to ask you questions. So how is the contribution of each major factor? Okay. And then, so this major factor includes T, technology, K, physical capital, H, human capital. Okay. So this growth accounting is going to decompose or to attribute the growth to each major factors. That is going to be in the aggregate production function. Okay. So now what is total factor productivity? Which is the amount of output that can be produced with a given amount of factor input. Okay. So when we observe an increase in total productivity, total factor productivity. So actually sometimes we short for TFP. When TFP is increasing, that means per worker turn, we can produce more for a given level of physical capital, human capital, and labor. But if it is per worker turn, so that means we can produce more with the same quantity of physical capital, human capital. All right. So the growth accounting exercise taught us increase in TFP are crucial for growth. But we need to understand how or what kind of policy can promote the increase in total factor productivity. Right. So before we understand that, so by looking at the growth accounting and by looking at aggregate production function, right? So we realize the technological progress essentially that just give you the TFP. Or in other words, the increase in TFP usually will measure the economic effect of technological progress. Okay. So now let's see how we can improve technology progress. This here. So by the way, so here this picture just highlight the importance of economic growth. So here we comparing two neighboring countries, North Korea versus South Korea. So this is a satellite image during the night. So you can see the northern part of this peninsula is pretty dark. In contrast, the southern part is very light. So this just reflects the level of economic growth, right? But where this economic growth coming from? So as we just explained, or what we just learned, largely come from technological progress, right? Now, remember, so we have slides that shows the difference in growth rate, right? And then, so why growth rate may differ? So here are three possible explanations. First, the saving and investment spending is going to differ. So actually, so this is going to lead to different level of physical capital. And then, so maybe there's a difference in education or research and development. So this education largely is going to affect human capital. And our research and development, sometimes we say R&D, this is going to affect technology, right? But what is research and development more specifically? So that's a spending to create and implement new technologies. Right? Like this background picture shows this American hero. So he had invented a lot of new ideas. And so those new ideas has changed, some of them has fundamentally changed how we live, how we work. Okay? But then certainly that changed into economic growth. Now, the other way to look at here, look at the growth difference is look at education. So we're comparing Argentina versus China. And we look at years of schooling. So that is approximate for education. But this education is going to be crucial for human capital accumulation. So the more human capital we have, and then so presumably you're going to see higher labor productivity. And accordingly, if you observe higher growth rate in human capital, and then certainly you're going to observe higher growth rate in labor productivity. Now, if we compare Argentina versus China, yes, certainly Argentina has better education outcome. But if we look at the growth trend, so you can see the growth in China is much rapid compared to Argentina. But then certainly, so that also explains why there's a divergence in their growth experience. Right? Now, given this discussion, so we may want to see what the role the government can play, right? And primarily it's going to focus on the human capital and technology. Right? So first, government can subsidize to infrastructure, but this is going to help the accumulation of physical capital. Right? Secondly, oh, by the way, so infrastructure includes roads, power lines, ports, information network, and other underpinning for economic activity. So essentially, those just physical things we need to build or to connect our modern economy. Okay. So second, government policy is a subsidy to education. So that's going to promote the accumulation of human capital. Like in the United States, K through 12 is free. And in the United States, so the federal and state government provide a lot of subsidy to higher education. Okay, so that's used to promote education, to make education more accessible to the general population so that we can improve human capital. Right. Now, the third policy is government subsidy to R&D. So this will help the development of new technology. Right. Now, next one is government policy maintaining a well-functioning financial system. So why this is important, or why financial system is important for modern economy? So this functioning financial system is going to encourage innovation, encourage risk taking. But innovation and risk taking, they are necessary condition for technology progress. Right, so that's why we need a government policy to promote financial system. And besides this government policy, so we also want a strong institutions that protect property rights. So this is going to encourage people to innovate, right? Otherwise, you may not want to innovate. You may not want to have your own business, because otherwise, because without the protection of property rights, so what do you have worked for, right? What do you have innovated? So you won't benefit much, right? Because people can steal your property rights, and then so that's going to discourage you to work hard, to innovate, to push the technology frontier, right? And then lastly, so we want political stability and good governance. Okay? So this political stability is important. Otherwise, the citizen may not want to save, or they may want to divert their resource to oversee. Right? But then, so the lack of fundings is going to hurt our economic growth, because those entrepreneurs so won't get support to implement their new ideas. So those are the role the government can play in promoting economic growth. But all the discussion is centering around physical capital, human capital, and the technology. Right? So we just explained how the government policy can possibly affect one of those three factors. But those are the factors are crucial in determining labor activity. Okay. All right, so here's the example of infrastructure, an example of importance of infrastructure. Right, so this is essentially a infrastructure was built 2,000 years ago. Right, so this infrastructure has promoted the local agriculture sector in a significant way. Okay. Now here is the case study. So during the past few decades, economists has found that there are several East Asian countries experience high growth rate, and particularly so they have studied the 4 East Asian countries or regions, include Singapore, South Korea, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. Okay. And then so they use economic growth accounting, as we studied, as I just mentioned to you a few slides earlier, to understand what is behind their economic miracle. And then with no surprise, that's going to tie down those 3 factors to talk about. First, physical capital, but this through high saving rate. Secondly, human capital. This work through good education. And the third, technology progress, that work through the good governance, protection of property rights, government subsidies. Right? Now, there's another case study that show you the divergence in growth experience. And particularly, we compare Argentina versus South Korea. So in 1960, Argentina, in terms of the economic outcome, is substantially better compared with South Korea. But then, so in the following 5 decades, things took a drastic turn. So if we look at 2013, South Korea, so their economy, particularly the real GDP per worker, is higher than Argentina. But what is behind this successful story for South Korea? But on the other hand, the unsuccessful story for Argentina. Okay, so that is going to tie down 3 factors: physical capital, okay, and then this here, irresponsible government action that erode the saving. So that's going to reduce physical capital accumulation. Second, lack of emphasis on education. Just remind you, I just show you a graph that is comparing the schooling in Argentina versus China. Yes, Argentina improved during past 50 years, but the growth path or growth trend is weaker compared to China, not mentioned compared with South Korea. But this is human capital. And the third, political stability. Okay, so that's going to undermine innovation, undermine risk taking. So that's going to drag down the technological progress. Okay. Now we may have another case study, and so you can ask, so what is the trouble for African economy? Okay, what is holding back African country? Okay, and then the answer again is going to tie into the 3 things we just talked about, right? Human physical capital, human capital, and technology, right? All right, so now here we are going to look at convergence hypothesis. So this hypothesis says over time, the real GDP per worker difference will narrow. Where does this convergence hypothesis coming from? So this actually comes from the diminishing return to physical capital. Okay, just remind you earlier we have a graph show you K and GDP per worker or labor productivity. And we have a curve looks like this. Okay? So essentially it says the more physical capital we accumulate, the less marginal benefit we are going to observe for additional unit of physical capital. Okay, so this diminishing return to physical capital eventually will lead to a convergence in real GDP per capita. Why is that? It's because once a country becomes richer or in the process of growth, they get richer. And then the country is going to accumulate more physical capital. Now, the more physical capital they have, and then the diminishing return to physical capital will kick in. meaning the additional unit of capital the country accumulate will bring less and less improvement in labor productivity, or equivalently, it's going to bring less and less economic growth. So just think about like in track and field, right? So the way we understand that is, so you have one person run faster than the other. But now, so the more you run, and then you feel more tired, and then you're going to slow it down. And then so eventually, so the other person who behind you will catch you up. So that's the story of convergence hypothesis. But again, so this is coming from the diminishing return to physical capital. Right? Now, if we look at the left-hand side of this slice, and then so clearly there is a convergence. Right? How we see that? Horizontal line is real GDP per capita. Vertical line is the growth rate in the period from 1955 to 2013. Okay, and then so we have a bunch of countries, and clearly you can see there's a nice negative correlation, meaning the richer you are, and then the lower the growth rate you're going to see. So that just means, so the poorer you are, you're going to grow faster, and then you're going to catch up with your rich neighborhood. Right? So this is on the left-hand side. But however, if we extend our study to worldwide, the story becomes a little bit murky. So it really is difficult to say whether these convergence hypotheses hold or not. If we compare East Asia versus United States, it seems like this is negative correlated. But do you see we have Africa? So they are very poor, but the growth rate is also very low. Right? But to summarize, there is convergence, but this convergence happens among countries who has similar institution, similar governance, similar technology stage. But if we broaden our study, you won't see this convergence. Okay, so in some sense, so this convergence is conditional. Conditional, we looking at some countries who are similar in terms of a political system, in terms of the original technology level. Right? So this is convergence. Now we have a practical question. So economic growth can be especially fast, not good A, for countries playing catching up with countries that already have high real GDP per capita. That is true, right? And B, for relatively poor country, if the convergence hypothesis holds true, is also correct. C, if the country is able to benefit from adopting the technological advance already used in advanced economy. So the answer is D. Okay, A, B, and C are all true. Okay, so we are going to skip this video. So now the last thing we'll help us to wrap up this chapter is sustainable growth. So what is sustainable growth? So this long-run growth that can continue in the face of limited supply of natural resource and the impact of growth on environment. How we understand that? So far, we focus on exclusively growth rate itself. but we haven't taken into account so the natural resource, so for example, oil, fossil fuels, okay, some minerals. We haven't taken into account they are limited supply. We also haven't think about the impact of our growth on environment, like climate change, like pollution. And then, so what is sustainable? Sustainable means, so we generate growth, but in the meantime, we are not put our natural resource in short supply risk. And we also not put our environment in damage. Okay, and so we have the resource, we have the environment that is sustainable, that can satisfy the long run economic growth need. So that's sustainable. Okay. And then there are three questions asked regarding to the sustainability. First, how large are the supply of key natural resources? And the second, how effective will technology be at finding alternative to natural resource? And then lastly, can long-run economic growth continue in the face of scarce resource scarcity? Okay, so those are the three important questions we need to address so that we can understand the sustainability of long-run economic growth. Now let's go one by one. So how large are the supply of key natural resources? So we are going to rely on geologists. Okay? But in terms of economics, so there's already has some response, right? So there's price spike actually, so that's going to reflect the limit of supply. At the same time, maybe increasing demand, right? Now, second, how effective will technology be at finding alternatives to natural resource? We are going to rely on our engineering to figure it out, like using solar power, use windmill, or some new energy. And then lastly, can long-run economic growth continue in the face of resource scarcity? Okay. So this is really a question for economists, right? And so if we look at the real GDP and oil consumption, so most of the time, at least up to 1980, so these two just closely catch up with each other. And then since 1980s, and we realize it's not going to sustainable, and then we come or at the same time we have better technology, so this trend start to reverse, and then the gap start to widen. So this reflects we are more aware of the sustainability issue, right? So this look at our domestic economy, but if we look at worldwide, so you can see, so there's something we need to be we need to be careful, right? So here we look at United States, Europe, and then China, and we look at their carbon dioxide emission. So that's considered the main threat to our environment and to climate change, right? And so coincidentally, so China's emission increase, and this corresponds to their economic growth. Or in other words, the country grow faster and usually they emit more, right? So that is a warning sign to the sustainability of economic growth. Now, in terms of economics, so we have solution, okay? And so the solution is to use to give people incentive to reduce their emission, to limit the damage, or to reduce pollution. And usually there are two options. One is a carbon tax. So this is a tax on carbon emission. Okay. The other one is a cap and a trade system. So essentially, they just give everyone a permit. Okay, so that just specifies the amount of carbon dioxide you can emit. If you exceed this cap or this threshold, you can purchase the permit from the market. But from whom? But usually, probably some firms have better technology. They haven't used all their pollution permit yet. Right? Okay, so we won't have time to go into the details to understand the difference between carbon tax and the cap and the trade system. But this will be discussed in details in your more advanced class, like your environmental economics or intermediate microeconomics. Right. All right. So, and then up to now, so we have finished the chapter on economic growth. And then so next we will study the labor market. Okay. Let's just take a break.